Hi everyone! Thanks for clicking on my presentation. My name is Mimi Mays and I'm a senior majoring in political science. I'm sad that I can't be doing an in-person presentation. The Q&A really is my favorite part, I swear. But I'm very excited to share the results of my senior research, so I'm really glad to have this opportunity. Since the interactive part is my favorite, I invite anyone watching to reach out to me with questions or feedback on my presentation or on my research in general. I'll be publishing this all as part of my senior thesis this semester, so I'd be more than happy to hear any questions or suggestions that you have. So let's get started. My senior research is on consistency in perceptions of inequality. So let's break this down. We are looking at 4 different types of societal inequality: education, economic, racial, and gender. These are very complex topics, so I've defined them here based on how they're conceptualized in my research. Education inequality occurs when the education system fails to supersede societal inequalities, and thus children from different backgrounds receive unequal educations. Economic inequality is disparity in income, pay, or wealth, but also in the benefits that such wealth afford people. The specific facet that I've measured in my research is the extent to which wealthier citizens can greater influence politics. Racial inequality is very nuanced, so for the purposes of this study, I'm simply looking at inequality both of outcomes and of opportunities for Black versus white people. And finally, gender inequality, the societal inequality between men and women. Now, I'd like to stress that this research focuses not on the fact that these types of inequality exist, or the extent to which they do, though that is very tempting, but instead how these types of inequality are perceived. So the extent to which people think they exist. So once we get an idea of how people feel about these different types of inequality, we want to see how these different perceptions compare, how consistent they are. But why measure consistency? So first, there's this fun idea that if you figure out how people feel about one concept, you might be able to figure out how they feel about another one. And that's called constraint. This certainly isn't a causal relationship. It's not as if thinking there's no such thing as sexism causes you to think there's no such thing as racism, but a useful tool in political attitudes research is being able to associate different values or policy attitudes with each other. So that brings me to political partisanship. Often attitudes on social inequality like these are associated with the values or the policies of a particular political party. Group loyalty and political partisanship often go hand in hand, so if a political partisanship aligns itself with consistent beliefs on inequality, individuals who identify with that partisanship may form beliefs congruent with that party's messaging. And that brings me to the implications of the impact of issue framing, specifically by mass media on the perceptions of inequality. Unfortunately, this specific concept is very interesting to me, but outside the particular scope of my research, but I want to acknowledge the importance of understanding the public's broad perceptions of inequality, both as a result of mass media and as something that could influence mass media techniques in the future. Now I will talk about my research. This semester, I analyzed existing data taken by our own Meredith poll in the spring of last year. The poll asked a lot of questions, so I took data from just 5 of the survey questions, in addition to the respondents' demographic data. One of the questions that I used asked about education inequality, one about economic inequality, 2 of the questions asked about race, and 1 asked about the perceptions of gender inequality. These results ranged in their formatting. Some were Likert scales, some thermometer. So what I did is I translated everything into a basic inequality index on a scale of 1 to 3. For each respondent, for each type of inequality, I collected whether they had a low, moderate, or high perception of that inequality. So going into my analysis, I had 4 hypotheses. Number 1, that North Carolinians will overall have consistent perceptions of inequality. Number 2, that Democrats' views of inequality will be more consistent than Republicans' views of inequality. Number 3, that educational elites' view of inequality will be more consistent than the views of inequality of other educational backgrounds. And number 4, that North Carolinians will perceive educational inequality to be higher than other forms of inequality. So my second and third hypotheses came from prior research that I encountered in my literature review. I actually found insufficient and inconclusive research about attitude consistency between political parties, so I wanted to test it myself. That's number 2. And then for number 3, this is based on a finding that political elites had more consistent views than the general public. My demographic data unfortunately did not capture whether or not a respondent held a political office. So my replication of that elite study is in reference to respondents' educational background. All right, let's get into some results. I'll start with top-line results, so just how people perceive these types of societal inequality. First, education inequality. The majority of respondents had a high perception of education inequality, but we also have a second mode at low, so a little bit of a split there. Next, economic inequality. An even larger majority of respondents perceive high levels of economic inequality. Next, racial inequality. Here, the lows outnumber the highs by 19 responses. That's the difference there. This question on the poll asked about the ability of racial and ethnic minorities to succeed compared to the majority. So this is more the inequality of opportunity, that concept that I mentioned at the beginning. Then our other race question asked about the racial wage gap. So this is more the inequality of outcome idea that I mentioned. Here we still see a large number of low responses, but the high does have a majority for this question on race. And finally, gender inequality. The majority of responses conveyed a high perception of inequality. Now, if you notice how the graph shifted from question 4 to question 5, race to gender, you'll see that we actually had the exact same number of low responses, 227 responses, but this is what's important. Those 227 low responses were not from the same people. So this is why we're going to move into consistency. How correlated are these different perceptions from these people? So to determine consistency, I ran the correlations of each of the question's responses with each other. So you can see each of the questions are here on the top and also on the side, and then here are the correlation coefficients for each of the intersections. And then down here we have the average correlation coefficient, which is just the average of all of these. And there we have it. North Carolinians, without conditioning based on any other demographics, have a correlation coefficient of R equals 0.32. This means that 32% of the change in perceptions of one type of inequality can be explained by the change in perceptions of another. Statistics. So let me return to my hypotheses for a second. My first hypothesis ended up being a little difficult to examine. It's not black and white. Where's the line between consistent and not consistent? An argument can be made that finding a coefficient of R equals 0 is definitely not consistent. And then negative correlations would indicate that a high perception of one inequality was significantly associated with low perceptions of another. So a negative association. I'll admit that I was mildly disappointed in the degree of correlation that I did find. Previous researchers saw coefficients as high as R equals 0.59 and 0.68 for some of their samples. As you can see here, the highest average correlation coefficient I encountered was R equals 0.38. And what I've done is I've made the average bright green so it pops out a little bit more. So as you can see, my averages were no greater than 0.5 and my highest average coefficient was R equals 0.38. So on one hand, I found that people's perceptions of inequality aren't very consistent. We don't have an objectively strong correlation. However, on the other hand, I didn't encounter any negative average correlations and no coefficients of 0. So across the board, to some extent, we see a positive correlation between perceptions of one form of societal inequality and another. So I think that's a win. Now, my second hypothesis is about the consistency of different political affiliations. So here we've got the average correlation coefficient for each of the political affiliations. Up in the corner there, we've just got the sample characteristics, how much of each type of respondent the survey was able to capture. So what I predicted was that the Democrats would have more consistent attitudes than Republicans, and I was technically correct. Woo! But what I didn't anticipate was this wild card, the independent voter. Independents exhibited the greatest consistency in their attitudes about inequality out of all of the political affiliations. So, second hypothesis, technically correct. Third hypothesis on the educational elites. In this study, I've considered having a graduate or professional degree as being elite. And lo and behold, we've got the elites exhibiting the greatest attitudinal consistency. Yay! Followed closely by the technical diploma folks, then the college folks, and then the high school folks. So, hypothesis 3 is supported. Yay. For fun, I've also run comparisons on the different groups within other demographic characteristics, even though I didn't have hypotheses on these. So, we've got age. Our 54 to 74-year-olds exhibit the most consistent perceptions of inequality. Then it pretty much decreases with age, but we actually see that the elderly respondents had the least consistent attitudes. Wow. Next, I've done gender, and by a small margin, we see that men have more consistent views on inequality. Lastly, let's look at my fourth hypothesis. So for this, we'll put aside all this talk of consistency and correlation, because this just refers back to those top-line results. So maybe it's that I've spent my last 4 years at Meredith, where we have a very respected education program, or perhaps it's because of my internship with the governor, where education funding is one of North Carolina's top budget battles at the moment. But I was curious about how North Carolinians felt about education inequality, and I thought maybe that they'd think that those issues were a little bit more pressing than others. So with that hypothesis in mind, let's look back at the data. So for my hypothesis to be supported, we'd want to see lots of high responses for the education question, as well as few low responses for the education question. Unfortunately, for my hypothesis, respondents more often thought that economic equality was severe, and there were actually a great deal of low responses for education as well. I'd like to clarify that respondents were never asked to rank these forms of inequality, so I cannot definitively say that North Carolinians think that economic inequality is the most significant form of inequality. I can't make that judgment. But I can say that what I predicted about respondents' perceptions of education inequality was not supported. Boo. So, in summary, 3 out of my 4 hypotheses are supported by my findings, and I found some really interesting trends in attitudinal consistency. Now, I want to take a second to think about what this all means. So, I found that North Carolinians' views on inequality are fairly consistent, but this doesn't mean that their views are accurate. It doesn't mean that they're liberal or conservative. It just means that they're consistent, kind of. So that brings me to my thoughts on future research. This study didn't even begin to look at how consistency intersects with the actual opinions that these people have on inequality. Are people who think that there's a lot of inequality more consistent in that viewpoint than people who don't think there's very much inequality? Another direction that I'd take if I was able would be to break down income strata. This Meredith poll didn't record income data, so I wasn't able to look at how that variable is associated with consistency like I did for race and for gender and for education background. Another factor is time. We often think about consistency in terms of consistency over time, but this research didn't have anything to do with time. I would be very interested to see how respondents' attitudes changed over time. So basically, the consistency of their consistency. And I would be most interested to see how attitudinal consistency changes when the political climate is different. These data were collected in spring 2019, but now it's election season. So conversations about social inequality and partisan stances on it are much more prevalent. And I would hypothesize that people have more consistent views in a time like that. I would hypothesize. Everyone always says, I hope to research topics like this in the future. And I'm graduating, so that prospect isn't particularly promising, but I sincerely hope that this will not be the last of my work on this topic. So I'll simply say, until next time, thank you all so much for listening, and please, please, please don't hesitate to reach out with any feedback you have. Thank you so much. Bye.